and to be filled with your peace as a result. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, good morning again. We are in the middle of a series of sermons, not picture perfect. We started this last week. If this is your first week to be with us, then you're not too late to get into some of this stuff. What we've been talking about, it came from a conversation I had with somebody a few months ago where we were talking about some things going on, and they said, I just wish my family was normal. And it's my conviction that there are no normal families. I think a lot of times we try real hard to have the perfect family or the perfect marriage or the perfect church, and I just don't think there are such things. I don't think they exist, and in our pursuit of trying to get to whatever that perfect thing is, sometimes we can make ourselves pretty powerfully lonely, and wonder how we're failing or wonder what it is wrong with us that's led us to this place or got us to this spot. And I think that's a dangerous thing. This hunger that we have to connect, but then also that sin creeping in and changing it to where we're only going to be happy if it's perfect, and it's never going to be perfect. I was reading a book by John Ortberg, kind of to get ready for this sermon again. It's an older book. He says, everyone's normal until you get to know them. And he quotes this survey that was done of children. And they got all these kids together, and they asked them a lot of different questions about political stuff of the day, and they said, how would you solve it? And one of the questions was this one. With billions of people in the world, someone should be able to figure out a system where no one's lonely. So what do you think? What do you suggest? And they asked kids this. And the first kid that I read about was this girl named Kalani, and she said people should find the lonely people and ask their name and address, then ask people who aren't lonely their name and address. And when you have an even number of each, you could assign the lonely people and the not lonely people together in the paper. So that might work. That could work. Max, age 9, said you could make food that talks to you when you eat. See, Max is going a different direction with his solution. He's a little less administrative thinking, maybe. But for instance, he says, it would say, well, how are you doing? Or what happened to you today? You know, you're sitting down to your beef and cheddar. How you doing today? Well, I'm doing all right. And you'd feel better, right? You could talk. Just one guy's idea. Another person said, well, we could get people a pet or a husband or a wife, which I think is a funny... I think that's funny. I don't know if it may have a hard marriage later on, but we give people a pet or a husband or wife, and they could take them places. And then there was this one. Brian said you could sing a song or stomp your feet or read a book. Sometimes I think no one loves me, so I do one of those. And this idea, this last one here, I think it is universal. I think sooner or later you're outside the circle. Everybody's getting together and they're doing their thing, but you weren't invited. Everybody's getting together and they're talking about something, but you're not on the inside. You don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I think everybody sooner or later goes through some moment where you feel like no one really cares about you or no one really knows what you're going through. And again, the risk, because we don't talk about it that much. We don't talk about the loneliness that we go through because no one really is very open about that. You might think that you're the only one. I read in a survey this week, 90% of men in America don't think they have a true friend, somebody they could call at any time who would be there for them no matter what. 90% of men in America don't feel like they have a true friend. It would seem like with billions of people in the world, someone would come up with a cure for loneliness. Someone would come up with a cure to solve that sort of problem, but no one has. People have talked about it. A guy named Plato, before Jesus was born, wrote a book called The Republic, which was his solution for the perfect system. A guy named Augustine wrote a book called The City of God, 400 years after Jesus. He thought, well, this is the solution. The Beatles sang songs about how all you need is love, and we can imagine this world where everything is perfect. And probably the most famous speech ever given in America was this dream of a place where black children and white children could all play together and we'd all get along. There just wouldn't be any division between us. And I think there's a hunger in everybody to be part of something like that, to go to a church like that, to have a marriage like that where you're never lonely. You know, sometimes in a premarital counseling, a couple getting ready to get married, and we'll talk about it, and they might say in the premarital counseling that the reason they knew this was the person for them was when I'm with them, we just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. I'm never lonely when I'm with them. And maybe the marriage continues like that, but a lot of marriages don't continue like that, you know? And even in marriage, or even in a friendship, or even in a church, you can feel this real sense of loneliness. And like I said, in the survey I saw 90% of men say that that's an issue for them. It wasn't as high for women. It wasn't as high a percentage. It wasn't really even close to as high. But it would not be unbelievable to believe that in a church this like us, that half of the people in here would have a hard time thinking of a friend that they could call at any time who would answer and be happy to help whatever the call was about. We all get so busy and we run so hard, and we're trying to build our families, and we're trying to build our career, and we're trying to pay our mortgage and do all the different things we do. And in the middle of it, we're outside the circle. And I was thinking about how deep I wanted to get into this thing when I was talking about it, because there have been moments where I've been there, where everybody was talking about something and it was obvious that they didn't want me there. Now, some of that's an occupational hazard. I don't ever get to hear the very best jokes, so I know some of that is that. But some of it's just stuff that everybody goes through, right? I mean, some of it's the stuff that everybody has to deal with. And I thought about how deep do I want to get into that, you know, moments when people didn't respond to my call like I thought they would, or people kind of excluded me, or when I wasn't invited and everybody else got to go. How much of that do I want to share? And I kept talking myself out of it. It's embarrassing to get into it. And I think that most people feel that way if they were to really think about it. And the weird part, and I'm not sure this is accurate, this is just my opinion, anecdotally, I've not done any research on it, but it seems, at least in American thinking, decidedly unmasculine to talk about that sort of thing. And that may be why so many men struggle with it. They just don't have a close friend, but they don't know what to do about it. It may be why, as Americans, sometimes we don't have those relationships that we wish we had, and yet we're in a bind to fix it. A quick Bible study, and this is one I do in a lot of weddings that I do. In Genesis 1, God makes the world. The first chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, he makes the world, and he sings over it, sort of. It's like every time he makes something, it's good, right? He makes the rivers and the mountains, and it's good. He makes the raccoon and the rabbit, and it's good. And he makes the flowers, and it's good. And just every time he's making something, he sings over it, and he blesses it, and it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And that's all in Genesis chapter 1, first chapter. Second chapter, God says it's not good that man's alone, and so he makes a helpmate for man, makes a partner, makes a friend for the man, makes the woman, and so they can connect, and the man and the woman. And there's even some interesting language about that he tears the man apart. Like some Bibles will translate it rib, but it actually says he took Adam's side, is what it says. It's like he rips the man apart and he makes the woman out of that, and then when they get together in marriage, they become one flesh again. Like they're torn apart, but now they're one flesh. And that's the picture of what it's supposed to be like. That they were divided, and now it's kind of sappy. That you complete me, or you all my weaknesses, you fill in all the weaknesses, and that's the picture, right? Biblically speaking, it's not good to be alone. That we were made to connect. And then in Genesis chapter 3. Sin enters the world. That's where the Garden of Eden and the snake and the tree and all that story, which is interesting because everything's good except for this thing. It's not good for man to be alone. And then sin enters the world. So this has nothing to do with sin. And in fact, this will be a design flaw, a little wrinkle in our hearts that I think goes on even into heaven. I don't think it goes away. We were not meant to be isolated. Even for some of the very worst people in the world, if you want to break them, you just put them in solitary for a little bit. There's something about being alone that we're not capable of dealing with. There's something about if a person is alone, we worry about them. We worry that they're a sociopath, or there's something not quite right about a person who's always alone. We're not meant to always be by ourselves. We're meant to connect. It's not good when we can't do that. Right? And I think it's baked into us. I don't think it's just because of sin. That's like that. I think I think we're like it because we're made in God's image, and God's like that. God is a relational God, and we're made to be relational, and it's part of who we are. But that's not to say that sin doesn't affect it. See, when sin comes into that picture, you got that need there that's already, and then sin comes into it, and it twists it and it warps it. And now suddenly you're not content with just a relationship. It's got to be a certain kind of relationship, and people can disappoint you so easy. People can let you down. People cannot come through like they're supposed to. People are the worst, right? And you can get so impatient with folks, and you're doing the best you can, but the other people aren't cooperating. And you think, why can't my family or my marriage or my church, why can't it be normal? And it's possible maybe that broken is normal, and that the person who's going to have to change to really build this thing is you. They did a study in Alameda County, California, where they studied people over a 20 or 30-year stretch, and they found that the biggest indicator of a person's health was if they had great relationships. If they had cultivated and built some great relationships, they were more likely to be healthy than any other contributing factor. It was better for you than exercise. It was better for you than diet. They made a joke in the middle of it. It was better for you to eat Twinkies with friends than to eat broccoli alone. You could make a T-shirt with that, and that would be true, and you could wear that around. It's better to eat garbage with friends. There's just something about friendships. A Harvard researcher, Robert Putnam, did a study on that study and expanded it and looked in. He said you can cut your risk of dying in the next year in half just by building some friendships. That's hard to believe, but I do know that we're relational creatures. And it would seem like, then, if that's the big need, and that's hard baked into us, that with billions of people in the world, somebody would have devised a secret for loneliness. And I think God has. And I think it's marriage and family and church. I think his plan still works today if a person really digs deep and invests in it. I think the same things that he taught us about in the Bible still work today. I don't think that Christianity has been found false. I just think it's been found challenging. And sometimes people don't want to contribute to this. And I'm going to talk about this 2 or 3 times. Everything I'm getting ready to say in this thing, you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. But I will say, I don't know that you're ever going to get to the mountaintop that's promised in Scripture unless you give some of this stuff a shot. So 3 verses. I just want to focus on 3 verses today, and they're all in Ephesians. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, as a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you received. The first part, Paul says, I'm writing from prison. Now, we live in a very tolerant country, but the Roman Empire was not very tolerant, and Paul was putting forward this new idea about how to relate to people. The Romans appreciated strength. The Romans appreciated muscle, and Paul is advertising a crucified Savior, and that message is not going on very well, and it's dividing people, and they don't know what to make out of what Paul's saying, and so Paul's in jail because he's been pushing this thing so hard, and he says, even though I'm in jail, he said, I've not quit. I still believe this is the message you need to hear. I still believe this is what can turn a person around. And he says, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. In American church culture, when we use the word calling, it normally refers to a preacher. A preacher might say, I felt called into ministry at this time, or God called me when I was 20 and led me into this thing. Or I feel called to go to this other church. A preacher might say that. Or I feel called to take this ministry on. But that's not how Paul uses the phrase. How Paul uses the phrase, he's writing to the Ephesians, a bunch of guys who lived in a town called Ephesus, just regular Christians, and he says you need to live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. So if you're a Christian, Paul says, there was some moment somewhere where it clicked. You had listened to the stories, or you had followed along and you were paying attention, and all of a sudden it clicked that there really was a God in heaven, and he really did love you, and loved you enough to sacrifice for you, that God in heaven was willing to lay down his life so that you could live again in heaven. And it made sense. For the first time, you saw the evidence about all of it, and it all kind of clicked, and you were called, Paul says, in that moment. In that moment, you realize that Jesus, we have a cross here on the back wall. It's got some red stone in it to remind us of the blood that Christ shed. He laid his life down on a cross for us, gave us everything. And now you've been called to give him your life. And the exchange, of course, is that you give him your life, it's broken, and he gives you back eternity. And he starts quickening your spirit, and he starts changing how you think, and he starts building you up into a whole different kind of, a new creation. He starts changing your viewpoint, and he gives you hope, because you know that one day, even when this body of mine fades and fails, he's going to carry me on into the next. And in exchange for that, you hand him the keys to the car. You let him drive. You let him be in charge of it. And that's what Paul's saying here. I urge you to live a life worthy of that calling. Now, what I would think, when I first read this verse several years ago, is if Christ has sacrificed himself physically, right? I mean, it was a bloody sacrifice. He was willing to, great courage to be shown and all that kind of stuff. He must want me then to do something brave. You know, go to Uganda and go in the jungle there and speak, or maybe give all my money away and just take some terrible risk with myself. You would think that that's what he'd be calling you. That's what this verse would be about. I would expect the very next verse to be about something courageous, really hard to do. And I guess it is, but it's not how I thought. This is verse 1. Verse 2 says, be completely humble and gentle, patient, and bear with one another in love. And the courage of all these things is learning how to be second, learning how to give in, learning how to lose on occasion. And it's really hard. You know what all these words mean, but just to make sure, humble doesn't mean that you can't be proud if you've accomplished something. If you've got a degree, you can be proud of your degree. If you're naturally a good athlete or naturally pretty smart or naturally attractive, you don't have to lie to people and pretend like you're not. If you know that you have certain things going on, that's okay. Humble means you don't use that advantage to get your way. That's the big thing. Just because you might be the smartest person in the room, you're not going to insist on getting your way no matter what. You're going to, on purpose, lower yourself a little bit to be with everybody else. And most of us have an inflated sense of ourselves, and so completely humble means you kind of work against that temptation. To be completely gentle means that you realize that people are fragile. People are easily bruised and broken. I had a friend who worked at the big Walmart warehouse in Seymour, and he said a lot of the guys there were just idiots, and they would treat the stuff so rough. And if it had stuff on the box that said fragile or this side up, they would on purpose go the other direction, just stack it upside down, or 6 refrigerators stacked on top of each other. He said, I saw a guy go up on top of a big stack of televisions. We had to get a television down, on top of this big stack of televisions, and just pushed one off the top. And it was smack on the floor, and they loaded it up on the forklift and took it out. And they just on purpose treat it rough. And there are people who do people that way. Just constantly throwing elbows around, constantly pushing people and treating them like they just work for you somehow, or that they're in your way, or that you're so frustrated or ticked off. And gentle doesn't do that. You lose the harshness. Patient means that you can take a punch without completely losing your cool. There are people, if I were to ask them, how many of you remember right where you were when 9/11 happened? Remember right where you were? Yeah. I mean, you can remember, you can feel it, right? There's people who may be older than that. Can remember where you were when the Challenger exploded. Do you remember where you were? Now, if you were in school, everybody had to stop and look at that, right? They put it on the screens and we all watched it. If you're older still, maybe you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot, and everybody talked about that, and you remember what you were thinking. I remember where I was when Ron Artest went up in the stands. Do you remember that? One or two of you do? It was November 19th, 2004, and I was in my living room, and the Pacers were the best team in the league, and they were beating last year's best team, and Ron Artest decided to lay on the scorer's table while everybody else argued, and someone threw a beer on him, and he went up in the stands. And I remember where I was. Our whole season fell apart. And not just that season, we lost 10 years of seasons because Ron Artest went up into the stands. And I remember being sick to my stomach watching it. I could just see all this evaporating. And it's a sad commentary about my life that I can remember where I was. I remember how I felt. I remember what I was wearing. when that happened. I remember it was like a moment frozen in time. And I'm not built like Ron Artest. Ron Artest is 6'7" and 245 pounds solid muscle. And maybe if I was built like that, I wouldn't like that either. Maybe if somebody threw a beer on me, I would lose my cool in the same way that he lost his cool. But I would hope I wouldn't. I mean, I would hope in that moment that I would realize you don't want to throw away the whole year here just to get even. I would hope that I would have some moment of thought. But there are people I know who have no moment of thought about any sort of slight, any sort of disrespect that comes your way, you immediately have to respond. And it happens so often, it just blurs into each other. The people around you expect you to erupt. They know you're going to do it. They'll joke about it. I wouldn't tell Dad, or I'd keep that from Mom if I was you. I mean, they know how you are. And patient, especially being completely patient, means you dial that back. You can take a punch now and again. And this idea of bearing with is the same idea of putting up with one another. Sometimes you're going to be with some knuckleheads, and you give them a chance to fail. You give them a chance to make mistakes without you losing your cool every time that happens. And that's verse 2. So verse 1, be worthy of the calling you've received. Here's how you do it. And then here's the goal, verse 3. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. In other words, you make every effort. This needs to be the forefront of your mind. I'm going to do whatever I can to try to keep us together. Now, that doesn't mean you lie. Doesn't mean you lie. If someone's done something awful, you can tell them. You can. But you don't have to tell them. I mean, they may already know. They probably do. And like the prodigal son story, when the son comes home to the dad, the dad doesn't lead with, well, here's what you did wrong, and tell him all those things. He leads with a hug, right? He leads with a party. I'm sure they talked about those things eventually, but you don't have to lead with that. Or you make every effort. You know, and we talked this last week, in every organization in the world, you've got to believe everything they believe to join, to belong. But not in church. You don't have to believe everything we believe to belong. There are some people in here who disagree with me about some things. We don't see it the same way. But we don't make a big deal of it. We know that some things are essential, and you've got to stick with those. And other things, there's room to disagree. But even on the essentials, a person could come here, and we may not see eye to eye on every last part of it, and you're still welcome. And family works like that. You know, you may have a cousin who's a knucklehead, but they're still your cousin. How many of you have a cousin who's a knucklehead? No, don't raise your hand. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Okay, but I shouldn't have asked. But you're still stuck with them, right? They're still part of the family. Blood connects you. And even in marriage, I mean, marriage is the most personal and the most painful when it goes sideways. Even in that kind of thing, you're not always going to agree 100%. Now, ideally, you're coming towards the other person all the time. Ideally, they're coming towards you, but it won't always work that way. And even there, this idea, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. I mean, it doesn't mean you agree on every last thing, but we're going to love each other. I can't promise we'll get it right, but we're going to love each other. And when I thought about this and thought about just teaching this idea, I immediately thought of lots of questions a person might ask. Because if you take it, literally here, these verses, you might think to yourself, well, what, do I have to give in then all the time? Do I always have to give in? Is it always me that has to give in? So let me answer that question first. No, you don't have to give in at all if you don't want to. You're free. You're absolutely free. If you don't want to give in, you don't have to give in on anything. You're free. You don't belong to anybody. Christ has paid your debt. If you choose not to, you don't have to. But I'm going to tell you, you're never going to get to the top of the mountain unless you trust Him on some of this stuff. And trusting Him on some of this stuff means you're going to have to give in now and again. It means you're going to have to occasionally lose. The Prodigal Son Story again. Are you all familiar with that story? The man had two sons. One son leaves, and he's gone for years. Wastes all the father's money, then comes back. And he's assuming that the father's probably moved on. I've got friends who, as soon as they went to college, when they came home 2 weeks later, their bedroom was gone. Everything had already been changed. So he's assuming he's been gone for years, right? He's been gone for years. And so he's assuming that no one's going to want him to come back. And the father's been waiting on him all the time. He runs and hugs him. How long did God wait on you to come back? Well, long enough, right? The answer is long enough. And so do you have to do it? No, you do not have to do it. You do not have to do it. Absolutely not. There's no shame in saying, I've had enough. And if that's where you're at, that's where you're at. But if you really want to get to where God has promised we can be, you're going to have to stretch yourself a little. You're going to have to push yourself a little. Well, how do I get started? Well, you jump in. Now, in the church, that probably means getting involved in a small group or a group of other Christians. Summer's the best time to get started. Even if the church doesn't have something going on that you want to jump into, get 2 or 3 other Christian friends together and have a campfire every week and just occasionally talk about the stuff that we're talking about. On purpose. Y'all read a chapter together or read a book together and let's just talk about it. And you don't have to be brilliant about this thing. Just start having the conversations. Pray together. Get together and just hang out. And at the end of it, we're going to pray for each other. And that's the whole group. And just keep pushing yourself a little deeper and invest in some other people. With family, it's tougher. If you've got some broken family stuff and you're trying to get back with family, it's tougher. And it's tougher for 2 big reasons. First of all, family knows how to change the subject. If you go back to family and you say, hey, I think we need to work on this or that or the other thing, somebody in the family could say, well, isn't that just like you? And then you're wrecked. Or they'll wink at you a certain way or look, roll their eyes or whatever, and you're wrecked. Family knows how to get under your skin. They've lived with you forever, and they know what to do to get you off topic. They know just the right tone of voice. They know just the right insult, just the right story to bring back up to get you off your game. And that's hard. That's really hard. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that because it's family, some of those wounds are deep, and they go back years. Every time my family gets together, and if we're together very long, they'll bring up stories about things I did in junior high and high school. Remember when he did that? It was like, I was 13, I was a kid. I'm 54 years old now. Can't we move past this? And they're just all horse laughing, telling the story again, and they're cackling, and isn't that funny? And it's not funny to me anymore, but it's still funny to them, and we just can't ever get past it. And that makes it hard, right? Family has a long memory of everything, and they know how to change the subject. So I don't think you necessarily go in there with a high and mighty attitude if it's family and say, well, we got to change this and this and this. I think you do some of the things in that other verse, that verse before this one. You humble, gentle, patient, bear with each other. I think you do some of that stuff. And it may take time. And especially, and I'm going to talk more about this here on this given in thing. We can talk about it right now. In the given in thing, sometimes you're the weak one in this thing. They did pick on you. It's not always 50-50, Sometimes they did a lot more to hurt you than you did. And you really were taken advantage of in a marriage or in a family or in a church. Sometimes you were the one who really lost. And I can appreciate if you say, well, I'm never going to put myself in that situation again. I get it. I do. And often that's the right decision. Now, I would tell you even there that you've got to forgive them. Even there, you've got to forgive them. You've got to pray to God to take that off your mind and let God handle it because you can't. Even there, you've got to move on. And forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It doesn't. Sometimes you got to move on, and I understand that. I do. And that's not wrong. It's just how life is. Sometimes that's where it's at. But if you go into your family deal or if you go into your marriage deal and you've spent several years digging this hole, and you go into it patient and humble and gentle, and don't let them get you too far off your story. And when you get off your story, you try to come back as quick as you can. You can even work on those things. At the end, it's the relationships that matter most. And it's worth the work. It's worth the work. Sometimes the other person needs to be told the truth, and I that's certainly part of this. Have the hard conversation if you need to. If you've been hurt several times, you may need to tell them. I've been hurt and here's why, and get into that. Just be careful about standing real hard on your rights, because God could have stood on his rights and chose not to. God could have stood on his rights and given you what you deserved and chose not to. So, one last thing on this deal, on this power dynamics deal. In the Bible, the strong cater to the weak. When I see Paul give advice, that's the advice I see him give a lot. If you're strong, you need to bend for the weak. And so when you think about yourself in these relationships and those places where you think that you're strong, and it can be both ways. Sometimes I can jump into a conversation and I feel like the weakest person in the room because I don't know what they're talking about, or I jump in. But if something happens here at church, I might be very strong because I have a lot of influence here at the church. And so sometimes it depends on where you're standing. It's not about you personally, but it's about where you're at. But if you're the strong one in the relationship, you're going to have to bend. And not just going to have to bend, you're going to have to lead in the bending. I talked about this several years. If you're just here for the first time because of the baby dedication, you don't have to participate in this. I'm going to say that ahead of time. You don't have to jump into this if you don't want to. But for those of you who have been here for a while, there are 12 magic words that can save you if you're strong. And you're going to learn them today. They're easy. 12 magic words that if you can master them and you're the strong person in a relationship, it can transform your relationship at home, in family, in marriage, and at church. The first three are, I was wrong. Say that with me. I was wrong. Let's look at the person on your right and left and tell them that. I was wrong. Some of you have been married for years and have never heard that person say that to you about anything. It's the first time that's come in. You've already taken a giant step forward in your relationship already. You didn't know you did, but just doing that has magnified it. And by the way, you don't even have to mean it when you say it. If you have this is true. If you have a little kid and you're a little guy and you're at Christmas, right? And Aunt Mildred has given your little guy a present, and it's a sweater that she made herself, and you wouldn't put this on the pet, right? You see the sweater, and the kid just really wanted a Hot Wheel. That's all he's asked for is a Hot Wheel, and now he's got this sweater in front of him, and you're standing by him, and you know he just wants to run off and play. And what do you say to your kid? What do you say? What do you say to Aunt Mildred? What do you tell her? And he'll say, thank you. And then he wanders off. He doesn't mean it. You know he doesn't mean it. She knows that he doesn't mean it, right? But there's something about saying it. Let's do it again. To the right and left. I was wrong. Boy, that's powerful. That's the first three words. I was wrong. Second three words. It was me. It was me. Together. It was me. I am sorry. I am sorry. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. Let's do it together. If you need to talk to somebody while you say it, you can. And again, you don't have to mean it. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to mean it. I'm going to say more about that in a second. You just got to say it. So try it again. I was wrong. It was me. I am sorry. Please forgive me. This will do wonders for you. I promise that it will. Because there's something powerful about saying it. And you know this to be true too. There have been times, men especially can identify with this, I know you can, where you know that what you ought to do is just say, yes, dear, and walk away. But you don't. This would solve the whole issue. We would be done fighting right now if I would just say, it was me. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I was wrong. It was me. Just say that, and you could walk away, but you can't. But you can't. You know you'd be lying, and you can't treat her to that kind of hypocrisy when all she's wanting is that kind of hypocrisy. All you got to do is just say those 12 magic words, and it will solve most of your problems. And especially if you're the stronger person, what's the most important thing here? It's the relationship. It is always the relationship. That is the most important thing. It's not that you win. And people miss that. Man, they miss it all the stinking time. I read this week that middle age is between 35 and 58, and I'm just about out of middle age. That was kind of sad to me that I found that to be true. Middle age was 35 to 58. I'm at the age where a person, in fact, I'm past the age where a person, unless I live to be 108, I'm already past the age where I should have had a midlife crisis. And I'm still waiting. I've told Julia what car I'm going to buy at my midlife crisis and all those different things. But I'm hoping it'll happen before too long, that I can just go through that. And what happens when you're in middle age, or when you have that midlife crisis, is you're old enough finally to see what didn't work. I thought this would make me happy, and it has not. I thought this would make me happy, and it has not. I thought this would make me happy, and it has not. And I think what's supposed to happen, if you're wise, is you turn to God. But sometimes we're not wise, and we think, well, no, what I really need is to double down. This house has not made me happy, but a bigger house might. This car has not made me happy, but a faster car might. This vacation doesn't do much for me, but a really nice vacation house might. Then I would really be happy. Some people have to double down. They have to experiment with a lot of things before they realize that the thing that's really going to make you blessed in this life is those relationships. I have never known anybody who had great marriage, great friendships, great connections in church, who was anything less than a joyful, peace-filled, power-driven person. There's no exception. I've never met anybody who was relationally rich who was poor in those other areas. But I've known lots of people who were poor in those other areas who were miserable. They weren't happy. They were greedy. They were alone. They didn't have great relationships with their kids. They didn't have great relationships with anybody. They started the church as a grouchy young man. Now they're a grouchy old man, and they never got off of that boat. And I've never known anybody who was relationally poor that way, who had this rich inner life. One of the benefits of the middle age thing and the old age thing, which I'm creeping towards every minute, is that I wish I could take some of that out of my head and give it to somebody in their 20s. That they wouldn't have to just figure that out. That I could just, like that movie, The Matrix, where you could just download information in your head. I wish I could just give that to somebody so they would see it. I wish if you were in your 20s and 30s and your marriage is a lot of work, and your family's a lot of work, and it's getting hard to want to keep up with mom and dad, that as they're getting older, it's just more demanding, and you're so busy, and you got no time for church, and relationships are hard. I wish I could take that out of my head and show you how foolish that is. Now, I know some people have to touch the stove. You can't tell them anything. They just got to touch the stove themselves to see if it's true. But it's true. And I wish I could give that to folks. When I talk to people about what their great regrets are, if I talk to somebody towards the end of their life, is there anything you regret? It's never about, I wish I had gotten that last promotion at work, or I wish my house was a couple 100 square feet bigger. It's never stuff like that. It's always, I wish the kids and I were closer. I wish I hadn't given up on my marriage as fast as I did. I wish that I wasn't sitting in here alone with no one to come see me. It's always relational. It's always relational. So Paul says, you should make every effort. Keep the unity of the Spirit to the bond of peace. It is this thing that enables us to be fully alive. And occasionally, it'll mean you have to apologize. Occasionally, it'll mean you have to apologize even when you don't totally mean it. Because the relationship is more important than you being right. I'm going to have the band come back up. I want to challenge you on this thing. I think every minute we advertise God. We don't know we're doing it, but we're doing it. Every minute we are. We're telling people what God's like. We're showing people if God is forgiving, if God is graceful, if God is kind. We're showing them if God is patient. We're showing people every minute if God has time for them. And if you don't, then why would they think that God would? And if you think they're worthless, why would they think that God might think they're worth anything? Little girl's drawing in Sunday school, and she's all by herself in the corner, and she's drawing. It's a lot of stuff. A lot of crayons are coming in, and the teacher says, "What are you doing, hon?" She says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher says, "Honey, nobody knows what God looks like." And she says, "They will in a minute." And that's your whole life. That's your whole life. You're showing what God's like. You're showing what he's like to your spouse. You're showing what he's like to your kids. You're showing what he's like to your church. I just want to challenge you to push. Now, at the end of our service, especially if you're brand new here, this is your first week, at the end of the service, we have people on both sides. And they'll pray with you if you want to pray. If you want to pray about anything, they'll pray with you. It may relate to what we talked about, but it may not, and that's okay. It's also possible that if we're talking about this thing, you start to realize that your life is relationally poor, not just with other people, but with God. There's just not much relationship with God there at all. And if that's you today, then you can come here at the end of the service and just pray about that, either with them or by yourself. You can find me after the service, and we'll talk about it. You can find Gabe, who was up here earlier and announcing some things. Find him, and we can talk about it. And let's talk about what to do next. You know, you can come here and pray about that and talk about it, or talk to me afterward. But don't leave this place and assume that it'll just naturally get better. And I say that to you even if it is your first week here. Maybe you thought you were coming here for something else, and God had you here for something a little more important. So if there's anything that you need to do that way, take advantage of this time. Won't you stand up? I'm going to pray with you, and we'll be dismissed. Dear Lord God, I thank you for this group. And I pray, God, for them. If there's anybody here who needs to draw closer to you, that you give them the courage to do what they need to do. Give them the courage, God, to pray like they need to pray.